Then we'll talk about some theories that they've been around for, 10, 20 years, but they work. There's good evidence behind them. And then some of the newer ones that are, honestly, they're not going to have as much evidence, and you're going to have questions that I won't be able to answer because they're very new. But they're also interesting directions where we're going. Okay, so I'm going to start with heuristics, which are basically biases. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these, but let's talk for a minute about how they actually impact persuasion. So real basic. So anyone who had the intro psych class, you've had this. And so the availability bias is a bias in which you estimate how frequently something happens by how easy it is for you to bring it to mind. And sometimes that's okay, because if something happens frequently, it is easier to bring to mind, and it's easier for you to think of examples of it. But there are other things that make it easier to think of examples besides frequency, and that's where this bias will mess you up. So, for example, which one of these animals, it's a trick question already, but generally, which of these animals would you be more concerned about? Which one do you think is more likely to hurt you? And it's by far and away the deer. Certainly in hitting a deer in traffic, but even actually deer attacking people is more common than sharks attacking people. But the reason for that is you don't hear about it when people hit a deer, unless it's you or your family member or Kim Kardashian. You're not going to hear about it. But if there's a shark attack anywhere in the world, you will hear about it. In fact, there was one in South Africa like 2 weeks ago. Somebody got their arm hurt, and it didn't even kill them. Not like that makes it that much better. But my point being, it wasn't lethal. I don't even think they lost any limbs. It was just a shark attack in South Africa, and I know about it here in Virginia. And so that really throws out of whack your idea of how common something is and how dangerous it is and how much you should be afraid of it. Another similar heuristic is the idea of simplicity and concreteness. Now, there's a few things I'm going to present here where you're going to feel like it doesn't characterize you. You have to remember that the people sitting in this room and sitting in that room in Maryland are not the average person. Okay, a bunch of scientists and computer software developers are going to be a little more analytical than your average person. Okay, so I do want you to remember that. Don't use yourself as a reference point. This even affects you, though. So when you recognize that this even affects you and then extrapolate to think, okay, that's me who loves numbers and loves data and lives and dies by it, and then think about people that don't and how much more this would be impacting them. So in this example, let's say you want to buy a car. So you have to think about things like, how much does it cost? Do I value safety, or do I value, mileage? What's important to you, and how do the different cars stack up? So maybe you go to Consumer Reports or someplace like that, and you get all this information. And you decide you're going to get a Hyundai. That's just data tells you that's the best one. So you roll up to the Hyundai dealership and you see this. And you think, maybe I don't want a Hyundai. And, maybe you still get it because you're a very, very data-driven person, but at the very least, this has given you pause. At the very least, this has made you think, gee, that's worrisome. And there's a part of you that knows logically that you have no idea if this is true. This could be somebody's, ex-husband or wife trying to get back at them, or who knows what, but it still makes an impact. And not only does it make an impact on you, do you think you're likely to tell somebody about this? Well, here I am, I've given this presentation 50 times now, and everybody has had the presentation has seen this picture. So think about how that information is getting transmitted compared to whatever is in this picture that you probably can't see it. You won't remember it, even if you analyzed it. That's not going to get passed on nearly the same way that this kind of really vivid example is. And so I didn't know until I put this presentation together that this is actually a common thing to do, to face their cars. Sorry for the language, but it's just too funny. And think about that. If you're thinking you might buy a Ford and you're sitting behind traffic on, this car in traffic on 66, you're going to have a second thought. You're going to think, going to have a second thought. And you probably will tell somebody about that when you get home. Oh my God, you're not going to believe what I saw. So to get an example that was a little bit more relatable to the State Department, I would turn it into what is known as the identifiable victim effect. And if you've ever seen those ASPCA commercials where they have the Sarah McLachlan song and the sad cats and you want to cry, they're taking advantage of that. And charities use this very effectively, which they should. It's good. But they know that if they give you stats about child hunger, it's not going to be as effective as if they show you a hungry child. One hungry child, who you may even believe is an actor, still will impact you more. You will think about it longer, and you'll be a lot more likely to respond. And there's actual, I've worked with the neuroeconomist, Paul Zak, in Claremont. He's actually tracked the level of oxytocin in your blood as you're watching these kinds of videos. Oxytocin is, it's a neurotransmitter in your brain, but it's a hormone in your blood. And it's associated with pro-social behavior and empathy and trust. And I could actually make you trust me more if I shoot oxytocin up your nose. Okay, it's demonstrated. So if instead of shooting it up your nose, I know which kind of video to show you, it'll have the same effect. And the best way to get a spike in oxytocin is to show a vulnerable, sort of empathy-inducing situation like these. So I don't know that the charities knew that was what was happening in the brain, but they probably tried a bunch of different approaches, and this is the one that worked. And so they've all kind of honed in on it. And again, this really is just another example of the vividness and a theme that you're going to hear more about, the fact that emotion far and away outstrips the power of logic in most situations for persuasion. Okay. Here's one. I know it looks very wordy, and I am going to have to read it to you for this to work. But I want you to imagine that I gave you these instructions, and I told you have to learn this process, and you have to be able to do it by yourself tomorrow without referring to these instructions, okay? First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that's the next step. It's important not to overdo things. That is, it's better to do too few things than to do too many at once. In the short run, this might not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put away in their appropriate places. Eventually, they'll be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. So now, if you don't get to look at that, can you do that tomorrow? Okay, but what?
Laundry.
He's totally right. That's now. Could you? Yeah, because that I just described doing laundry, which you probably don't really think of as a super complex process until for some reason you have to break it down and you realize there's actually a lot into it. So I kind of learned this not too long ago because we have an au pair. We got an au pair from Brazil where they don't use dryers. They just hang all their clothes. They use washing machines, but not dryers. And it's just funny, the things that you don't realize how complex they are. If it's a brand new concept to somebody, it's very difficult for them to remember. So the idea of what went in and what went out, what didn't go in the dryer, and opening the little lint thingy to get the lid, all that stuff brand new. And so what seems to me like a really simple thing I should just be able to explain once sounds to her like this. And so that's something that I think maybe probably does also have a UX angle to it. But just in general, if you're trying to teach something to people, and especially if you're trying to persuade people of something, think about how simple it seems to them. So the examples I just gave you of the shark and the child, they told you that things that are simple are more persuasive, but it's not what's simple to you, it's what's simple to the person you're talking to. So that's important too. So you have to flip it around and think about that. And so where this comes in with the State Department is they'll say they're trying to teach people, how to do a visa application or something. And you remember, sometimes these are people in countries that they don't even have formal schooling. And you give them you think a visa application looks simple? I bet it doesn't. So yeah. And then they're like, why don't they understand? You got to think through what it looks like from the other side if it's this unfamiliar. It's another interesting one. Again, maybe UX people might be familiar with this one, the paradox of choice. So you kind of feel like your intuition would be that giving people lots of choices would be a good thing. People generally would say they like lots of choices. And this is one of those situations where people don't know that well what they actually would want. There's pretty good evidence that there's a sweet spot of the number of choices, and it's not that big. It varies by context, but it's like 3, it's not 20. And when you go too many choices, you have poor satisfaction. People actually make worse decisions. There's an increased likelihood they won't do anything at all. They'll just say, forget it, and not choose anything. So where I experience this is in the grocery store when I'm trying to find my cereal. And I will tell you, I've been eating the same 2 cereals, Basic 4 and Raisin Nut Bran, since, I don't know, 10 years. And it's not because there's a lack of choice. It's because when I get to the cereal aisle, it's so ridiculous that I'm just going to go with my default. I'm just going to say, yeah, I don't really have an hour and a half to sit here and think about cereal. So I'm just going to go with my defaults. So that's something to think about. If you're trying to get somebody off of a default, this is not how you do it. Another place where this was used well, and they're veering away from this somewhat, but for a long time, if you wanted an iPhone, you got to choose between black or white. That was it. and then I think then after a while you could choose a memory level, and then that was it. And now there's different colors. There's the 8, there's the X, and so they've kind of come away from that for a bit, but it didn't hurt them at all to have only those 2 choices. That seemed to make people perfectly fine with that. And that seems very counterintuitive to folks. So what this is getting at is that there's a limited amount of information that people are willing to deal with. And if you exceed that information, they're just going to shut down and stop. And they're not going to hear anything after a certain point. And that's something that you need to think about from their perspective again. So not how much information does it seem like to you, but to them. And that's going to depend very much on how familiar what you're talking to them is about. What you're talking to them about is it for them.
Does it help if the choices are broken up into different categories that they don't have to deal with all at once?
Yes.
Like with the color thing, you may have 3 colors, 3 different memory levels. Technically, that's 9 choices.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't have to deal with them as 9 choices. You can deal with them as 3 and then 3.
Absolutely. Yes. So in fact, sometimes you really have that many choices. You really do have to present somebody with that many choices. And so what I suggest in that case, exactly what you're saying, is you have to, well, for one, you have to recognize that that's the most important thing, and you have to back up and slow it down for the decision maker, and you have to give it in bites, right? So like for the cereal aisle, an analogy would be, I think they just put them by brand. I'm not sure how they put them, but what if instead they had all of the Raisin brands here and all of the Cheerio varieties here and all of the muesli things here? That would actually make it a lot easier to choose, easier to find what you're looking for, and more likely to actually consider a similar thing. Yeah. Because I would be like, okay, I'm ignoring everything that comes with a toy. I'm ignoring everything that looks like it's got twigs in it. Okay, here's by area. Oh, and now I only have 20 to look at instead of 70. Absolutely. And so what you're doing is you're managing the information load. You're helping manage it for the decision maker. Another one, again, still sticking with the simple biases, is the mere exposure effect. And this is the fact that the more often we're exposed to something, all else being equal, so this isn't something you inherently hate, but the more often you're exposed to something, the more you accept it, the more you trust it, the more you like it. This is the concept behind brand placement, right? That's why they try to, lots of movies, when you watch them, they're using a Mac. Why? They're not saying anything about the Mac, and they're not displaying its capabilities. All you see is the back with that little apple on it. But it's the idea that they just want you to see it a lot. So there is that adage that familiarity breeds contempt, and that's really not true. The research doesn't hold that up. It holds up instead that familiarity breeds comfortableness, to neologize. So an example sort of from our popular culture is gay marriage. And I know a lot of people feel like there was a real sudden turning point, and there was in terms of legal issues. It did seem to just within a couple years, like a bunch of dominoes fell, and the legal side of it changed really quickly. But that didn't happen culturally really quickly. That has been growing for a long, long time. And so the slides, probably hardly anybody's old enough to remember this one. I'm not. Will and Grace, probably some of us are, some of us aren't, and Modern Family's on right now. But I want to think about the progression in these. So Soap was a show in the 70s where Billy Crystal was the first gay character on television, or at least on mainstream television. And he was in that show. They didn't show his relationships. He didn't get married, nothing like that. It was just the fact that he even existed on there was a huge, big deal. And then you get, into the 90s, so 20 years go by, 20 years, decades. And then you're at Will and Grace. And now you've got a show that's got multiple gay characters. And so you can actually show that they're not all identical. They have their own personalities and their own kinds of lives. And they're more fully developed characters. And they're central to the plots of those shows, which Billy Crystal was kind of like a side character. And so, and again, this was, on for years. It was a very popular show. It was one of the highest rated shows for a long time. But, it's a sitcom, so it's kind of innocuous. So think that all of the people that in just little half-hour increments over years, we're having this little bit of exposure to the idea, a little bit of exposure to the idea. And then you come around to where we are now with Modern Family, which, again, 20 years have passed, but it's another big evolution because now, again, two gay male characters, but they're married, they've adopted a child, they're part of this larger family, and they're not treated like a different part of the family because each part of the family's got their own weird quirks and things like that. One's way older and, and it's just all like one big family. And so it's becoming more normalized, but that progression of television shows there is 50 years. It's not overnight. But that, and of course, this isn't the only place where gay characters were showing up, but that kind of very slow, incremental, repeated exposure over a long, long period of time has this kind of cultural impact. It doesn't, obviously this goes both ways. Culture is impacting the shows and shows are impacting culture. It goes both directions. But I like to show this, for one, to show how familiarity works. It does work, but also to show that these things take a very long time. Smoking is another example. Smoking has really, really gone down in this country, but it took 20, 30 years of anti-smoking campaigns. And that's something that is not what the people at state usually want to hear. When I tell them, how do we change the culture? Well, this is how. It'll take 3 or 4 generations, and this is how you do it. That's, that's the truth, though. And here's one we've probably all been a little more aware of the last couple of years than usual, which is a false consensus effect, which is the mistaken, you overestimate how much other people think the way you do. And that gets worse the more you're in bubbles, and social media has absolutely exaggerated that. And that's not news telling you that anymore. That was something that might have been news a couple years ago, but since the election, everybody knows this. Let's see. Oh, I'm going to go forward. Truthiness. It's a fairly new addition to the deck because it's kind of a funny pop culture thing, but it actually is correct. So truthiness, there's now journal articles on truthiness. It's a real scientific construct. So truthiness is how true something feels. So again, we're going back to emotions again. It's not how true it is, it's how true it feels. And all of the things that I just told you play into how true something feels. How familiar is it? How easy is it to think about? How much does it seem to reflect how you already think? How much does it, how vivid is it? How emotional is it? Those are all the things that play into whether something feels true, regardless of the facts. So you can have true things that are truthy too, right? They're not mutually exclusive, but they're two separate constructs. And the last bullet. Oh, actually, Let me go down these. So familiarity we talked about. So easy to follow we talked about with that laundry example. But here's a funny one that's got a lot of support behind it. Really peripheral qualities of things that make them easier or more difficult to process make a big difference. So something like someone speaking in a foreign accent, you find it less believable. The font's kind of hard to read. You find it less believable.
Unless it's
yeah, sorry, Michael. This is a really weird. If the room that you're reading something in is more dimly lit and makes it harder to read, it's less believable. It's the same exact content as what somebody else read in a brightly lit room, and that makes it less believable.
I can't believe it.
I know. It's probably my California accent. And then last one that's really important with social media is that the first thing you hear tends to stick. It's way harder to dislodge something that you've already thought than to get you to think something in the first place. It's
That's terrible.
It's terrible. It's 100% true, and it's terrible. And that's why the bots scare me, because they can. So I'm gonna get ahead for a second about what's in the propaganda presentation that I'm not giving today. But if you look at what the Russian playbook is for disinformation, one of the key things they do is it's super, super fast. When anything happens in the world, they're putting out stories about it that are not true within minutes. And there's no way you're going to get the true story that fast. And so you will have already seen their fake, weird interpretation of it before you see the real story. And honestly, it's easy to do things really fast when you can just make it up, right? I mean, you don't have to worry about fact checking or making sure you got the truth or anything. You just make it up. That's easy. You can even write all this stuff beforehand and then just stick in a couple, like, it's like a Mad Lib, put in the names and the locations and shoot it out.
You don't even have to wait for something to happen. You can just be like,
that's true.
I just want to put out a story.
That's true. Then you'll really be the first one. Right. Exactly. Okay. So I'm going to take a step back and talk about some more specific, more specific techniques and theories. And this next piece is on compliance and conformity, which is getting somebody to do what you want them to do. So persuasion is getting somebody to think what you want them to think. Compliance and conformity is related, because getting them to do something. They don't necessarily have to believe it, though, and that's something that sometimes people conflate. You can get people to do something without them thinking that they believe in the concept underlying it. So a lot of the really interesting work on this actually comes from watching salespeople, people who are just really naturally good at talking people into, handing over money for things. These concepts are scientifically verified, but in a lot of cases, it's because somebody noticed them doing it in sales and then they took it into the lab to further understand it. So the first one here, feeling of indebtedness and the drive to reciprocate. This is a really important one in sales tactics. I don't know if you guys have had this experience with someone giving you a hard sell, but they will act like you're doing them favors and they're doing you favors. That's because it works. And even when you don't give them the favor, that's okay. That doesn't ruin the effect, because if they ask you for a favor and you say no, now you feel a little bit bad. Now you feel like, okay, well, I didn't give them that favor, but I feel bad. So you're actually more likely to give in on the next thing they ask you. This is an odd one. If I want you to like me, it might help if I do you a favor, but it's actually more effective if I get you to do me a favor. And yes, I know. And the reason is because later on, when you're reflecting on that interaction, you might not remember like your underlying thoughts, but you're going to remember you did a favor for me, and you're going to interpret that later as, oh, I must like her. I did her that favor. Like, why would I have given her a ride to the airport? I only do that for friends. So we're friends. That's how that works. So if you can get somebody to do you a favor, they will like you more, actually, than if they had done it for you. Yes, weird. I understand. And this does work for both positive and negative reciprocity. So what I mean by that is, if I do you a favor, we're doing each other favors, we build a lot of positive feelings. And in fact, if I do you a small favor, you're more likely to do a bigger one back for me than is even called for. But that also works with negative interactions. So if I give you a small insult, you're going to come back at me with something bigger. And so that's also something to think about, that reciprocity goes both ways. And so when you're thinking about things like revenge and escalations of hostilities, that plays a big role. And then something else to know is that will even take place if it's against your own self-interest. So you've all, I'm sure, heard the term cutting off your nose to spite your face. Yeah. So this is when somebody would prefer to hurt you, even if it hurts them, than to just do nothing. And that's what's happening here, is the need to reciprocate will override your self-interest. And then finally, this does happen here in the US, but it is actually a stronger effect in most other parts of the world, because most other parts of the world are more concerned with social harmony, and the rules of how people engage with one another are more important to them. And that makes reciprocity more core to their motivation and how they think. So as much as we all hear this and say, yeah, I could see where I'd feel like that, we're on the low end of the spectrum for this. This is something that's a big motivator for some other cultures. So this slide comes from a pretty old study, 1951. Let me explain to you how it works. So ignore the graph on the side. Imagine that we're all here in this room, or you guys are all there in that room, and just one of you is going to be my experimental subject. So who do I see in Maryland? I'll use Michael because I know he's there. And then in here, we're going to use Teresa. And I'm just going to say, okay, Teresa and Michael, you see that line marked with an X over there on the left, right? Okay.
Yes.
Tell me which of the lines on the right, A, B, or C, matches X.
B.
It's pretty easy, right? I hope. So that's the right answer. Yeah, no, not a trick. But now I can't run it this way because I'd have to go through all kinds of pre-planning. But if I had planned with everybody except Michael and Teresa beforehand that they were all going to come in here and say A, and I went around the room and I said, Tanya, which line? Oh, A. Okay. Which line? A. Wow, which line? A. By the time, and Teresa's like going to be 10th here. By the time I got around to Teresa, she'd be sitting there going, what the heck? And you might question your eyesight, but at the very least, you're going to think, did I misunderstand the question? What? Why is everyone saying A? This is so weird. And what that graph on the side shows is in this exact task with these exact lines, how often people gave a conforming answer, which would be A, instead of the real answer, and it's graphed by group size. So if the group is if there's only one other person that says A, then you're not very likely to say A. But by the time the group size is up to 8, you're a third of the time the person will say A. So not all the time, but a third of the time in this example where it's clear as day that A is wrong. Okay, when you run a study where the lines are closer together or it's a more ambiguous, then that shoots up and it gets very high. So this is the impact. It's peer pressure, right? It's good old-fashioned peer pressure. But the thing is, it doesn't just impact what you say. The fact that it makes you question it is important too, because it makes you unsure and insecure in your answer. And when you've put somebody in that place, you're able to nudge them a lot easier to think different things. So, okay, this is lines, but what if instead of lines, this was a climate change argument, right? Obviously, lots of things are going to make it a lot more difficult to understand. I've already told you all the things about what's going to stand out being vivid, polar bears and floods, and then, but there's all this data, and that's going to look like that chart in the car with the, who can pay attention to that? It's going to be complex language that you might not be familiar with, like the laundry example. And so you're not going to be real sure if it's A or B or C. And then if everybody in front of you said A, that will matter a lot. If everybody in front of you said C, that will matter a lot. So
surely not everybody's wrong.
That's exactly what happens. It makes you second guess it. And even if you give the right answer, you also feel less sure of it. So there's a lot of different things that will impact the magnitude of this effect. But one of the most important things to know is that dissent mitigates it a lot. So in these line examples, just so again, a very simple experiment with these line examples, just having one dissenter, so just one other person in the room say B, or at least not A, they could even say C. Then when it gets around to Teresa, she's going to say, this is all very strange, but she's not going to feel quite as unsure of herself as if it had been unanimous. Other things that matter are personal variables, like how sure someone is of their confidence in this topic, how important the group is. So if instead of these guys, it was like Sarah and John and Todd and Jill, then Teresa's going to feel even a little more likely to say A. And then something that's really important and really effective is prior private commitment. So if instead of asking everybody and then coming to you, Teresa or Michael, if instead I said, okay, everybody write down on a piece of paper what they think the answer is, fold it up, set it in front of you, and then I come around, even if you don't show me the paper, you're more likely to stick with your real judgment. So having some means of getting people to clarify their position to themselves in advance will help steel them against this effect. So these are all things that when I'm talking to people, you can use them in either direction, right? Like if you're trying to get somebody to conform, like you have a child that you're trying to get to eat his broccoli or whatever it is, these are things you could use to move them that way. But these are also things that if you want to make sure your child is resistant to, you can use these things too, and think about how to plot out the arguments or the environment so that those buffers are there.
Always play devil's advocate for everything.
Well, remember the importance of the peer group. What you really want to do is get one of their little friends to be the devil's advocate. It would be way more effective. Okay. Yeah, so if you can find the one little buddy.
The adults don't understand, that's right.
Yeah. Let me check the time here.
Oh, you got 20 minutes.
Okay, so actually, is this the one I want to do? Yeah, I'll do this one and then one more after this. This is a really key one too, in terms of like, now we're getting to a little bit more advanced ideas of persuasion, things that are going to be pulling more things in together at once. And the role of identity is really, really critical, and it played a huge role in what everyone thinks happened in the last election and what's happening with the two parties right now, that there is a real tremendous shift in how people are connecting their identities to things in the political landscape. So an identity is someone's idea of who they are. So your conception of all the things that make you you. And we all have a lot of different facets, right? So we are all next century employers. Some of us are engineers and some are not. We're all Americans, but maybe you actually think of yourself as a Virginian. I actually don't. I've lived here 5 years, but I still think of myself as a Californian. And so these are all the different things that are part of your identity. Maybe you're a parent, maybe you're a sorority sister, maybe you're a little brother. And these are all pieces of how you put, your pieces of yourself together. The extent to which all those pieces glue together is culturally dependent. So probably a lot of you have heard about interdependent or collectivist cultures versus independent cultures. So on a spectrum, Americans tend to be way on the individualistic side. Things like Europe is sort of more in the middle, and Asian cultures tend to be more on the collectivist side. But I do want to tell you that what I just said is a gross overgeneralization, because even in the US, like even in this room, people are at different points on that scale, right? So don't think of it as really that clear cut. And you actually can move on that scale depending on your context, right? So here, and we're probably all fairly independent feeling at the moment. Some of you around your family will be a lot more collectivist than you are in this room. Depends what your family's like. So you can even move on that scale yourself, depending on your context. But in general, US tends to be more individualistic than most of the world. And what that means is that an American's identity tends to be a little more stable from situation to situation. So you tend to really still kind of feel like the same person regardless of where you are. In a very, very collectivist culture, there's a much greater difference between how a person thinks of themselves at home versus at work versus with their friends. And you can actually pick up physiological changes. They'll have different brain rhythms. They'll have different heart rhythms. They are really seeming like very different kinds of people in these different circumstances. And you can pick up on different biases to different extents depending where they are. It is weird. It is weird. And in fact, I think it's Japanese. I don't speak Japanese, so I can't. It's one of those things where if you're an outsider to it, it's very difficult to understand it. And so as an outsider to it, I can't give very good examples. And even if I could, you probably wouldn't get them anyway. But in Japanese, one example that was pointed out to me was that people have different words for the same person depending on what role they're in.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we don't do that.
Well, they even have different gender-based language. So one of the State Department examples is there were mostly female teachers teaching all State Department employees,
Mm-hmm.
and the men were getting giggled at because they were using female language, things that men just shouldn't say in Japanese culture.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so that idea that you're truly a different thing because you said something different is yeah, we don't really have that. We might say it's like funny that you used the wrong grammar, but it's not the same thing. So why does this matter? Well, because in terms of trying to persuade people to do things, sometimes one of their identities is going to be better suited for you than another. So let's say, for example, I'm trying to stop honor killing. This is something that the State Department does focus on, or child marriage. If you're in the mindset of village elder, because you're the village elder, and you're thinking about yourself having to give an example to the village, or provide a moral compass, that's one identity. If you're in the identity of parent, that's a different identity. And to the extent that you can get somebody to put this problem set in one of those identities versus the other, you're going to have different challenges and different levels of success in talking to them about these things. And so, like I said, it's hard for us to imagine the big gaps that they have. But even for us, you can imagine, like, if you have to decide whether to give your child a vaccination, are you thinking of it from a scientist point of view, or are you thinking of it from a mom point of view? At least for me, So if I'm thinking from a science point of view, it's clear cut as heck. I know exactly what the right answer is, and I do get my kids vaccinated. But if I'm in a real mom place, I do see, though, gosh, those poor people are just very scared. And I understand being scared for your kid, and I can see how that would impact them. And so I feel a little different about that concept based on the way the frame of mind I'm in. I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to try it.
Good morning. In less than an hour,
Can they hear that?
aircraft from here will join others from around the world. And you will be launching the largest aerial battle in the history of mankind. Mankind, huh? Words should have new meaning for all of us today. We can't be consumed by our petty differences anymore. We will be united in our common interest. Perhaps despite that today is the 4th of July, and you will once again be fighting for our freedom. Not from tyranny, oppression, or persecution, but from annihilation. We're fighting for our right to live, to exist. And should we win the day, the 4th of July will no longer be known as an American holiday, but as the day when the world declared in one voice, we will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight. We're going to live on. We're going to survive. Today, we celebrate our Independence Day.
Look at that. You feel like, yay, Earth, right? And I mean, how often you walk around thinking of yourself as an Earthling? Rarely, I'm assuming, right? But this is an example of how you can use compelling storytelling to shift somebody's identity frame. And again, because our identities are not as distinct in the US, but it still works on us. But imagine a place where this is even more of an issue. And so an example of a place where you might utilize something like this is in Lebanon. I don't know if any of you know anything about the Lebanese political system. It is extremely complicated. And they have all these different factions, and different people can think of themselves as part of a certain political alliance, part of a certain religious set, part of a certain part of the country, part of a certain socioeconomic group, and any one of those identities will lead you to support different kinds of policies and things. And how you might want to shift somebody's decision politically is to shift their identity and get them to think of themselves first and foremost as an earthling, or whatever it is. And so this is sort of an example of, it's a movie way of doing it, but that's what it's doing. And so that, I think, is also happening here right now with our political system. It used to be that we all knew what Republicans were and we all knew what Democrats were, but now it's like, where does a blue collar person go? It's not clear anymore. And it used to be that they had an identity and they knew where they fit in terms of the political system. And I don't think that that's true right now. It's sort of in flux. And that's something that if you want those people to vote for you, you realize their identity is in shift right now. I could make them feel like this, or I can make them feel like that based on how I'm playing to that identity. I think I saw a hand.
Yeah, I was asking, so when you say by priming identities, you're actually talking about just trying to make them think that they are that identity at this time.
Yeah, and it could be really explicit, like saying, hey, you're blue collar, but it could also be like, this is not saying you personally, you're an earthling, but because you're watching a show where that's like an important theme, it kind of comes up. And so think about, like, say somebody watches a soap opera every day, mm-hmm. and there's something in there that keys into one of their identities. So that for an hour every day, that identity is brought to the fore for them. That kind of thing can have an impact.
Or you could do something like with your Japanese example, just refer to them by a different pronoun.
Right. And and again, it's going to be a gradual, subtle thing. It's not like doing it once will matter, but if you do it over and over and over for months and years, it matters. It matters a lot. Okay. There is an exception to all of this that is very relevant for counterterrorism work. So identity fusion. So this is one of those new areas of research. Like, they're doing it now. So I won't have all the answers. But there is a process called identity fusion, which is when a personal self and a group identity become totally fused. So those of you who are into Star Trek might think Borg. It's the same idea. Borg.
Cults.
Cults is there. Yeah, cults is here. Mobs? No, well, I know what you're thinking. There's a collective behavior, but this is permanent. Oh. So what you're thinking of, there is something happening there, but it's kind of a temporary group dynamic. This is permanent. So this is when your personal sense of self becomes completely merged with a group identity, and it does sometimes happen in cults, to the point where you don't value yourself and the group any differently. So other members of the group are equally important as the group and as you. There's no difference anymore. People that are in this state will describe it as a visceral oneness with the group. And this is associated with being willing to take extremely costly behavior for the group. So if you're in a cult, drinking the Kool-Aid literally and dying for the group would fit into this. So would being a suicide bomber, or going off to fight when you know that there's very, very, very little chance that you'll come back. So this is something that they've been studying in detained ISIS, fighters. And normally, what I just told you would work. Normally, doing something to highlight the person's personal identity and contrast it with the group would help you pull them apart from the group. But that doesn't work if somebody has gone through this identity fusion process. In that case, it actually backfires. They will become defensive of the group. So highlighting or threatening the personal self will increase the allegiance to the group. So it's trying to pull them away from the group and saying, no, look, they're bad for you. That will backfire. And that's opposite of the normal reaction. And then as far as we know, again, we've been studying this all of about 6 years, so who knows? But as far as we know, once fused, always fused. They haven't seen any examples of people who became unfused. Now, you might be thinking that there are people who became de-radicalized. That's true. I'm not saying that everybody who's radicalized is fused. They're not. This is only a small minority of people that are radicalized are actually at this level of identity fusion. The ones that you see, though, who have actually, even if they're kicked out of the group, let's say they're detained, they've been ostracized, the group has decided since they're detained, we don't trust them anymore, but they still defend the group and they still won't defect. So that's that level of fusion. This is just an example of the way they measure it. So they actually take this picture to different guys that they've captured and ask them, look at these and imagine the red circle is you and the black circle is your group. Show me how you guys fit together. And okay, over there on the right, that's people that are not fused at all. And then like the next one in, I should say on the left. So the next one in, where there's a little bit of overlap, we might all have that with groups. We might have like that level with Next Century or our group of friends where we say, certainly there's some common concerns, but I'm still my own person. In the middle there, that might be, your family if you're real close. And then the next one over, sometimes people ask me, well, aren't special forces guys fully fused? And I would say no. I'd say they might be the next to most fused one, but they still have some things about them that are separate. They still have their own families that they care about. When they're off on missions, they're still thinking about their wife at home. And they imagine one day they might retire and not be part of this group anymore. So they still have a self. They may be more fused than a typical person, but they're not completely fused, which is what you see on the far right. As long as they're not completely fused and there's still a sliver of personal identity you can work with there. So I have less than 10 minutes left. I'm trying to decide actually, I have one more. I'm going to do this terror management one. Sounds cool.
So just on that's diagram you showed. So when they do this exercise, a small number of people will just move the circle all the way in.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's not the only measure, but
okay.
That has turned out to be a good, solid, quantifiable measure. But so when they would also be collecting data on things like how, they give them a choice. Like if you had to, do a suicide mission or save your daughter, which would it be? They give them those kinds of things, and they find the same people that give you the totally overlapping circles give you a really different set of answers to those kind of questions than everybody else. And that doesn't mean the other ones aren't dedicated. They can absolutely be dedicated, but they will still say, yeah, but she's my daughter. I have a responsibility. I'm still her dad, even though I'm here on a mission. The same way our soldiers would be. Just because you're not fully fused doesn't mean you're not dedicated to the cause, but you still have your own self. Right? Okay, last thing I'm going to throw at you here. Terror management theory is not about terrorism, despite the name. Although it can be applied to terrorism, but it can be applied a lot more broadly than that. So this is a theory that originated in the 80s, and it's been getting more and more evidence behind it, and now it's pretty solid. And when I explain it to you, it might almost now sound like common sense to you, but it didn't even 5 years ago. People didn't see it as true as they do now. So terror management theory predicts that, well, first of all, everyone has their own sort of cultural worldviews. Like we know that, right? And your cultural worldviews can be supported or threatened by things that are happening in your world. So if, for example, if you're in the steel industry right now, you're probably feeling pretty happy. Your cultural worldview is being supported by tariffs being put in place. But if you're in other industries that are going to be hurt by that, you're feeling threatened. If you're a free trade person, so to make it a little more abstract, if you're a free trade person, you might feel like your worldview is under attack. If you're pro-gun, your worldview probably feels under attack right now. So there's those are the different kind of facets of worldviews and where they might be right now. So the more threatened you feel, the tighter you hold on to your worldviews and the more you dig in. And oddly, it goes across the board. So if you feel threatened on your view about jobs and you're a pro-gun person, you'll dig in on pro-gun. Okay, so it doesn't have to be that the view that got threatened is only the one that you dig in on. It's across the board. You dig in on everything because you're trying to kind of bolster your own place in the universe. And this will also, it doesn't have to be a threat to a worldview. It can be an actual threat, like physical. So if you take folks and take their, how pro-gun are you, how pro-life are you, that kind of thing, and then you give them something that physically threatens them, like you give them a lecture on how awful their eating is and they're going to get cancer from it, or something like that, which I don't know how they got that through IRB, but that's what they did. And then you give them the same scale, they're more extreme on all their views. Now, this doesn't make you more liberal or more conservative, it makes you more whatever you are. You just go further to the extremes. So some real specific effects are, you see increased in-group and out-group biases. So whatever great things you thought about your in-group, now you think they're even greater. And reverse for the out-group, whatever you didn't like is now even worse.
Doesn't lecture me about cancer.
Yes. The more extreme positions I mentioned, more vigorous defense of your worldviews across the board. Reduced tolerance for ambiguity and shades of gray. That stuff, you don't want to hear it anymore. It's this or it's that. Forget the middle. And then lastly, the one that really strikes me lately is preference for strong and iconic leaders. So as you begin to feel insecure in your place in the world, or even like your physical safety, you prefer strongman leaders. And, if you look over history, you'll see swings in this. And times when people feel generally pretty secure and happy, they will tolerate a lot more shades of gray, and they will tolerate like Obama style leaders where it's not a black and white, there's considerations and things. And it's not just happening here. I'm sure you all know it's happening across Europe as well. And then places where the default is an insecure place, people will actually very clearly tell you they prefer strong leaders. So at my last company a year ago, we were developing scales to use in Iraq. And I kind of thought, let's try this one. I don't know what they'll say. And so there's a scale of authoritarianism that measures to the extent to which you want an authoritarian, like regime type government versus authoritative type government, which is strong but not dictating. And in the US, you will have people prefer the authoritarian, but when you talk to them about it, they kind of deny it. They kind of they actually implicitly want that, but they don't believe it about themselves in a sense. In Iraq, it's very, very clear. Oh, they absolutely want a strong man. They absolutely want someone to come in and clean things up, and they don't nearly care as much about freedom as safety. Shouldn't be surprising, right? If you know about Maslow's hierarchy, freedom's useless if you're terrified all the time. So when you're in that state of threat, you prefer somebody who is strong and powerful, that seems to be where the world has gone in the last couple years. I don't know if that's ISIS or who to blame exactly, but that does seem to be a phase that we're in right now. So when people ask me how to use this in persuasion, I say, I don't exactly know how to use it to your advantage, but I can at least tell you how to not use it to your disadvantage. There's some don'ts. One is if you're trying to get people to cooperate and come to a common ground and not be biased towards each other, avoid mortality and threat reminders. Avoid threatening their worldviews. Avoid telling them that the way they think about anything is wrong, which is a hard thing to do when you're trying to persuade them that the thing that they think is wrong. But that's why it's hard. But that's what you have to do. So just anything you can do to help them feel more secure and safe will make them more likely to be a little bit more compromising and a little bit more tolerant. On the other hand, if you like the direction they're in and you want to make them more extreme, then by all means, do all kinds of things to threaten their worldviews and make them feel unsafe. You will push them further in that direction. And then finally, probably most importantly, be aware of what's happening in their context that's causing that. So the gun debate right now is a really super clear example of this one, right? It's people are going further and further and further. And every time there's a shooting, anti-gun people or pro-gun control, whatever you want to call them, they feel scared, like their kid's going to get shot. That's a real clear threat. So they back up into their corner. And then pro-gun people think, oh, now they're going to take my guns away. So they feel scared and they back up into their corner. And so it just keeps going further and further and further apart. And there's other things coming into play there with sacred values and things like that. But that's certainly part of what's happening in that dynamic. I think I'm out of time. Yep, I'm out of time. Sorry. I don't.
Keep going anyway.
I probably should rather just schedule another one, but I'm happy to. Or I could sit here and answer questions as long as people want to ask them. Up to you guys, or up to you, Michael. I don't know what you usually do.
If there are questions, you're welcome to ask.
Okay. I know I'm over time though. Sorry about that.
So you okay with scheduling another session with Ture?
Yeah, I am.
Is there a general interest?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So let's do that.
Great.
Okay. Yeah, and hopefully I didn't scare everybody too much. It's the disinformation one that's really scary.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.